Hi, my name is Clay Wood, and I'm a PhD candidate at the Penn State Rock Mechanics Lab, and I'm going to discuss some of my preliminary results from my project that aims to understand the pore mechanics of dynamically stressed fractured rock. Before moving on, I want to acknowledge my collaborators and advisors for all of their help with this work. Like I said, the motivation for this project is to understand how stressing in the subsurface affects the pore mechanics. Dynamic stressing can result from injection, pumping, and transport of fluids. These industrial activities, energy recovery, storage, may pose significant risk associated with accelerated deformation, fault reactivation, and possible damage to reservoir seals. For example, these field observations from 2 wells in China show long-term trends of permeability. Over the course of about a decade, there are several earthquakes, denoted by these purple arrows here. The interesting observation here are prominent enhancements in permeability, as seen by these 2 red arrows, in direct response to earthquakes, or the elastic waves propagating from earthquakes result in a transient change in subsurface fluid flow. Observations like these are well documented in the field and lab. These findings are significant because seismicity, or dynamic stressing, affects fluid flow and might determine long-term evolution of hydrological and oil-bearing systems. Now let's look at the effect of dynamic stressing on the material properties of the subsurface. This study was conducted at San Andreas Fault Observatory at depth using cross-well piezoelectric transmitter as a source and an accelerometer as a receiver to continuously monitor the stress state in a seismically active fault zone. The authors observe a time delay in the transmitted signal during seismic events, the red and green bars here. These transient changes are then followed by post-seismic evolution. Dynamic stressing propagating from seismic sources results in a transient reduction in stiffness, followed by some interesting post-seismic relaxation. So as a quick recap, field observations show that seismicity, or dynamic stressing, can induce changes in elastodynamic and poromechanical properties of the subsurface. And so the observations show a decrease in wave velocity, or an increase in time delay, and increases in permeability. And so the relevant mechanisms that we're interested in here are fracture properties such as rock type, roughness, aperture, etc. So the key questions are, what are the fundamental mechanisms that relate hydraulic, flow, permeability, and elastic properties of rocks? And how does the geometry of faults and fractured rock, the interface, aperture, affect the hydraulic and elastic properties? And so to do that, we are using laboratory experiments and we're using multi-physics modeling. But for this talk, I'm going to focus on results from our lab experiments. We try to simulate field conditions in the lab using our biaxial deformation apparatus in the Penn State Rock Mechanics Laboratory, in which we install a pressure vessel, which we fill with a confining fluid, which we then pressurize to achieve our retraxial stress state. These other pressure intensifiers allow us to control the fluid flow rate and fluid pressure inside of the fracture plane of our sample. And here's an image of what our typical experiment looks like. Inside of the pressure vessel, we have our sample that's loaded in here. The yellow latex membrane separates the pore fluid pressure from the external confining fluid pressure. This PZT in the horizontal direction allows us to measure the compaction and dilation of the fracture. What makes our apparatus unique is the use of our loading blocks, or side blocks, which allow us to measure the permeability and transmitted waves concurrently. And here's an image of our sample. We pre-fracture a L-shaped block of westerly granite, And you can see here some of the larger roughness. To explore the fracture properties, we use dynamic pore pressure oscillations, and we modulate the stress state, or we progressively close and then open the fracture aperture. So the general protocol is, after we've prepared our sample and loaded it inside of the pressure vessel and applied a triaxial stress state, we saturate the fracture by displacing the air, and then we can begin our dynamic stressing protocol, in which we apply an oscillating pore pressure at the inlet, and we monitor the outlet pore pressure, PPA and PPB respectively. And so here's what our experiment looks like. Took a little over 34 hours to complete, so it's a pretty long and pretty complex experiment. And at each stress state, ranging from 10 MPa to 20 MPa, we have multiple pore pressure oscillations with amplitudes ranging from 0.2 to 1 MPa. And for each stress state, we have multiple repetitions. Here I'm showing what our experimental data typically looks like. I've chosen a 1 megapascal amplitude, 1 hertz pore pressure oscillation, and the resulting velocity and permeability. And I'm noting the initial state of the velocity and the permeability in these gray bars. So in response to this perturbation, this oscillation, we have a decrease in the velocity, or this delta C, and we have a transient increase in the permeability. Furthermore, we have these evolution after the perturbation has finished. And so to characterize the nonlinear elastic changes of the fracture, I have delta C over C, and I'm also measuring the permeability changes with this delta K over K. Before moving on, I wanted to quickly highlight the difference between a linear elastic response of a material compared to a nonlinear elastic response. So here we can see that in a nonlinear elastic material, there's a change in the velocity after a perturbation compared to a linear elastic response where we don't see this. Another quick comparison that I want to show is the velocity changes that we observe compared to the estimated time delay that has been observed on the field scale. So this red bar again represents the coseismic transient increase in time delay, or a reduction in velocity, and then a characteristic post-seismic evolution, which we see some similarities in our results. Similarly, we have an increase in permeability followed by a post-seismic or post-perturbation relaxation, similar to what we have observed in the field. These are just quick qualitative observations, but it hopefully puts it into perspective that we are seeing some similar responses in our system. Another important part of this project is characterizing the fracture asperities so that we can better understand the underlying mechanics. So for our westerly granite sample, we've produced a tensile fracture, and we've characterized it in a couple of ways. First, we use this pressure-sensitive film to essentially photograph the asperities at different stresses, and we've also used high-resolution profilometry that we will then use for our numerical models, which I won't talk about here. To connect our active source measurements to our asperity evolution from pressure-sensitive film, we calculate the spatial extent to which our PZTs measure changes in the fracture plane. Here, I show the calculated acoustic field propagating from right to left in a homogeneous medium, which shows the change in amplitude. This blue region is called the Fresnel zone. Along the fracture plane here, we consider the half-power bandwidth area to be most sensitive to heterogeneities, such as contact disparities. To drive this point home, I'm showing the fracture asperities from the pressure-sensitive film measurements. And this figure here shows the contact area with the PZT footprints, these colored circles superimposed onto the contact area. And here I show how the contact area evolves with the applied stress. And I have this dashed line here to indicate a possibly Hertzian relation between the area and the stress. And over here I show the contact area for each PZT footprint for two separate experiments. And we can see a similar relation. So back to the experimental results from our dynamic stressing. So I'm going to show some results from our relative permeability changes and our relative changes in velocity. Here I'm showing the relative change in permeability as a function of pore pressure oscillation amplitude. And as we can see, as the oscillation amplitude increases, the permeability correspondingly increases. For increasing normal stress, or as the fracture closes more, this relation still holds. However, the slope changes. And I've plotted this slope below. So I have the relative change in permeability slope as a function of the stress, which summarizes that the permeability enhancement decreases with increased stress state, or with decreased fracture aperture. Similarly, I'm plotting the relative change in velocity, delta C over C, as a function of oscillation amplitude. The colors correspond to the PZT locations across the fracture plane. Here we can see for effective normal stress of 10 MPa that the delta C over C, or this measure of nonlinearity, decreases with oscillation amplitude, or that is to say, the magnitude of nonlinearity is largest at the largest oscillation amplitudes. As we increase the stress from 10 MPa to 20 MPa, we can see that this relation, or this slope, changes, which is summarized down here, which shows that there's a dip at 12 MPa, but then the magnitude of the nonlinearity decreases, gets closer to zero with increased stress state. And here I'm relating the relative change in velocity to the relative change in permeability, which, as the normal stress increases, we see an evolution of less permeability enhancement. More points are on the left, and we see that the points also travel upward. That is, there's less nonlinearity and there's less permeability enhancement at higher stresses. To summarize, there are observations of transient changes in fluid flow and wave velocity in response to seismicity or dynamic stressing in the field. We simulate field conditions in the laboratory with well-controlled experiments to investigate this relationship. Our observations show that stress state modulates the permeability enhancement and fracture stiffness. Continued work will use high-resolution profilometry and numerical simulations to understand the underlying pore mechanics, which would be constrained by laboratory and field observations.